Hey everyone, Den Haring here. Welcome back to my channel, Fish Den 365. You know, last Thursday, I went fishing for a few hours in the evening, and I rekindled a technique that I used years ago and began using again with success on that day. Got a phone call. Hello? Hi, what's up? All right, I'll talk to you. I'll see you when I get home. All right, bye. Sorry about that interruption there. The wife is wondering what I'd like for dinner. I'm just a few minutes from home, and I'll be back there as soon as I get done explaining to you what we were doing with this technique. So it involves fishing a crankbait, specifically a squarebill crankbait, and it's something that I've done years ago and haven't played with recently. So let me tell you a little bit about it. I was on Lake Onalani, and it was a Thursday evening, and the weather was such where we had some stable weather and there was a front approaching. They want it rain the next day. In fact, thunderstorms coming the next day. Generally, when that happens, the fishing is going to be good. The fish are going to be more active. And so I was expecting to be able to get them to chase. On top of that, Onalani is not a pressured lake. It's a lake that you're not allowed to have boats on, and so because of that, it never really sees a lot of pressure. I get a kick out of it when I see on some of these forums people think that that lake is pressured. It is not. There are some people that fish it from shore, but even there, you can't access much of the lake from shore. It's just not very easy. And so there's only one time during the year where the fish where you can really get access to them, and it's in the winter when the ice is on the lake. And where this lake is in eastern Pennsylvania, on average, you might have 2 weeks to ice fish it. On real cold winters, maybe 4 weeks max. On other winters, maybe nothing. If there's not enough safe ice, you can't even get out there on the ice to fish it. So this is not a lake that's heavily pressured, and therefore, even when the frontal conditions are not as they were, I still tend to want to fish more quickly there because the fish are just a little dumber. They're not pressured fish at all, and so generally you don't have to finesse the fish as much to catch them. And so if anybody's watching this video and you fish Onalani and you think it's pressured, I'm sorry, it's not. If you want to fish a pressured lake, go to Lake Nakamixon, go to Blue Marsh, go to Beltsville. Those lakes are pressured. They have boat traffic on them constantly. There's people constantly fishing for those bass, and every lake, every acre of that lake is touched with fishing lures. Onalani, not so much. There's bass in that lake that haven't even seen a lure. And so I thought I'd be able to catch them on this particular day just throwing out a swim jig and reeling it back, or a spinnerbait. And neither one of those techniques was working. I got some short hits on the swim jig where they were biting the tail, but they didn't want it. And so I remembered that back in the days where I used to fish the Pocono lakes almost exclusively, I would throw a minnow bait, a top water minnow lure, a surface minnow, a floating minnow lure. And what you would do, there's a number of ways to fish a floating minnow. One is you can just kind of make ripples on the surface like an injured bait fish. Another is to just reel it real slow so it wakes on the surface. And then the third way is to use your rod or your reel to make that lure go under the surface and then stop and let it float back up again. And that's oftentimes when fish would hit it. When it was floating up, they'd hit it, or when it reached the surface again, they'd hit it because it looked like an injured bait fish. So I actually did that a little bit, and I did catch a fish doing it, but I was not able to get that floating minnow lure out as far as I'd like to, and the fish just didn't seem to want it. And part of the reason for it, I think, is because the water had a pretty good stain to it from previous rains. So I decided to take a squarebill crankbait and fish it the same way that I fished that floating minnow. And so the squarebill, you can throw it out a whole lot farther, and you could wake it on the surface if you fish it slow enough, but they didn't really want it that way that day. But when you do reel it down and reel it quickly, it makes a lot more vibrations, because that squarebill and that square-shaped body just makes a lot more vibrations. The bass can feel that, and they can see it a little bit better. And so that's what I did. I picked a crawfish-colored squarebill, but really I was trying to imitate a bluegill. It looks like a bluegill also. And I think this probably works best in lakes that have bluegill, although I wouldn't be surprised if it works well in shad lakes too, like with a shad-colored squarebill, shad or alewives. but generally I think of bluegills when I'm throwing this, and I was actually throwing it around some lily pad shoots that were just coming up. And when I first started throwing that squarebill, I would just reel it down just so it would go down a foot or a foot and a half and then stop, and then reel it some more. I wasn't trying to get it into those lily pads, obviously, and there was some milfoil around out there too, and I didn't want to really dig into the milfoil too bad. The neat thing about squarebills, though, is they do come through that cover very well. Like if you start to feel that cover and stop, they actually back out when they float back up. And so it's kind of a neat technique. And I caught a few by reeling it and stopping it and reeling it and stopping it, but as the day wore on, they didn't seem to want that so much anymore. They wanted something just looking like it was really struggling. And so what I was doing was I'd reel it down and then I just let it float back up to the surface. The key, though, was to let it float back up on slack line. If I tried to stay in contact with the bait by not having slack and letting it float up, they didn't want that. It had to have slack line in it, and I think the reason for that is when I would reel it down and stop and leave that slack line, the bait would actually turn. That squarebill turns, and I think it looks more like an injured bluegill when it does that. It's going down, it stops, and then it turns like something's wrong with it, and then it floats up to the surface. And when I did that, I started getting some strikes. It was a little hard to know when that was happening. You'd have to watch your line, and even though there was slack in the line, they would hit it. A couple of fish would actually hit it and run with it, and so there was no doubt then they grabbed it and I felt them and I could set the hook. But every now and then you'd get some that would hit it, and you just kind of look for that little jump in the line, and then you'd reel down and they'd be there. So I caught several that way, and I lost a big one that way. That's the one downfall with this technique. As those lily pads get thicker, it's going to get harder to get those fish out of the pads. In fact, this bigger fish, it was probably a good 4-pounder, got me down into the pads and just kind of what I call padded me. It just got me down into the roots of those pads, and then the bait pulled off onto the pads, and the fish just pulled away and got off. So I lost the biggest one, but I caught a few others doing this, and it was kind of a fun way of fishing where you can just reel that thing down through the pads, stop it, let it float back up. Sometimes they would eat it. Most of the time they would eat it before it ever got to the surface. But one or two fish actually waited until the thing got back to the surface and then either sucked it in or blew up on it. I had both of those circumstances take place. So you can see as you're watching this video, you know, how I'm doing that and what I'm doing to catch those fish. And so I'm thinking about, as these pads get thicker, this technique could be good at any lake that has lily pads that are not totally grown in yet, where you can kind of steer the bait around those pads. Probably will work very good in the fall when the pads start thinning out. And so I'm already thinking about how to use this squarebill in those circumstances, because the squarebill is a big fish bait. It just catches big fish. At least for me it does. And I really enjoy fishing it because I like fishing that erratic style. That erratic bait, that erratic retrieve tends to trigger strikes. And this is just a variation on it, where you get that bait going down there, you stop it, and it has this erratic look to it as it's going up, like it's hurt, and then it tries to get back down. It's almost like it's struggling to get down into the water, and then it struggles and floats back up to the surface again, like a sick or injured fish. And so that's the attraction of the technique. And so I'm starting to think about, as these pads thicken up, maybe the thing to do is to bulk up with your gear. I was using a medium light crankbait rod, because it tends to fish a medium light or a medium crankbait rod tends to fish this bait pretty well. It's a 6.5-foot rod, but I use it for crankbaits quite a bit because it had this softer tip. But I'm thinking that as the pads thicken up, maybe you can catch these fish a little easier, especially the big ones, by bulking up a little bit on the rod. You still want that tip for casting and for action of the bait, but if you bulk up on the rod and maybe choose stronger treble hooks, you can muscle those fish out of the pads before they ever can get down in there, even though you got trebles on the squarebill crankbait. So there's something to consider, and I will probably experiment with this as the weeks and days move forward, and then again in the fall. So look for it, and if it happens again, I'll point it out on my video. But in the meantime, it's a technique that you might like to try and experiment with and catch fish on your own with, and I hope that's what you do. So give it a shot when the next time you're out. If you're fishing those kind of conditions, And whatever is, maybe the techniques that you're using aren't working, before you give up on those pads, try this technique, see if they don't want it on that particular day. The fish change throughout the, from one day to the next, and even throughout the day, but you just never know. This technique could be the one that catches you the fish of a lifetime. Well, if you liked that video and thought it was helpful, give it a thumbs up. Please share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and each time when you do subscribe, hit that bell. That'll give you a notification for when the next video is coming, or when the next video is available. I'm going to continue to try and put the best quality of information. Again, we're all about the art and science of bass fishing, and the art and science of fishing in general, but especially bass fishing. So the science talks about understanding the fish and the nature of the fish, and then the art is developing methods to utilize the science to catch those fish more effectively and have more fun doing it. Bass fishing's great because there's so many different ways to catch fish, and it just you'll never get bored. There's just a lot of different fun ways to catch them, so that for me is part of the fun. Remember, we're certified Bassified, and as always, may God bless your fishing endeavors.